We've got some breaking news, Jags fans, as Devin Lloyd, the stud linebacker, second team All-Pro, really exceeding for Jacksonville's defense last season, one of the heart and soul players for this Jags defense last season. He has officially signed with the Carolina Panthers. During NFL free agency, he is signing a 3-year, $45 million deal with $25 million of it guaranteed. We're going to be breaking down the latest in terms of Devin Lloyd, what this means for the Jaguars going forward, and also we're going to be talking about the latest Brian Thomas Jr. rumors coming out from Connor Hughes, who covers SNY for the Giants. But if you guys haven't realized already, I'm at home right now. We were at the studio all day, and when news like this happens, we got to make a video. We promise to get you this information, this content for you guys surrounding the Jacksonville Jaguars. No matter where I'm at home, whether I'm at the studio, I'm going to try to get you guys the best content available wherever I'm at. So if you could, hit that subscribe button. It greatly helps me out. It's completely 100% free. And I just want to try to build the best Jags community I can here on YouTube. So if you hit that subscribe button, tell a friend, like the video, it'd be greatly appreciated. So I want to pull up this tweet from Mike Garafolo, who's first on the news in terms of the information from Devin Lloyd, who said the following: sources to me and Rap Sheet. The Panthers have agreed to terms with linebacker Devin Lloyd on a 3-year, $45 million deal with $25 million guaranteed. Deal done by Andre Odom and AJ Stevens, who I'm assuming represent Devin Lloyd in this regard. Look, Carolina, big spenders today. They signed earlier today Jalen Phillips, the former edge, not only of the Miami Dolphins, but of the Philadelphia Eagles, to a 4-year, $120 million contract. They're trying to improve the defense under Ajiro Evero. So they get a guy, not only in Jalen Phillips, but also Devin Lloyd, who can be kind of that centerpiece of the defense. Again, had so many great moments for the Jags last season. And it was always the risk that the Jaguars took by not picking up his 5th-year option. He had this, breakout season where, he was all over the place in terms of, pass breakups, tackles for loss. Had that infamous pick 6 against Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs during that amazing primetime game that the Jaguars won at the buzzer. And look, it was one of those things where Devin Lloyd, we kind of talked about it all offseason. We always thought that he was going to be priced out of potentially re-signing with the Jacksonville Jaguars, just given their cap situation, given the commitments they would have to make. I mean, James Gladstone would have had to really bend backwards in order to re-sign Devin Lloyd. Now, I'll be quite frank and honest. This contract, I feel like Carolina gets low-key a steal for Devin Lloyd. I had projected that at bare minimum, contract negotiations for Devin Lloyd were going to start at $17 million per year. It's kind of similar to what Zach Bond has with the Philadelphia Eagles. He signed a 3-year, $51 million contract. I thought Lloyd could get something similar, if not higher, potentially even threaten to reset the linebacker market, but that's ultimately not how the money dictated itself for off-ball linebackers, and it's a shame for Devin Lloyd because I think he deserves to get paid. Don't get me wrong, $15 million is nothing to scoff at, but when you're sitting there talking about the relative play that he had compared to his peers, I thought he was going to get a true cash-in opportunity with something in the range of like $17 to $20 million per year. So the fact that Carolina is able to get him in for $15 million per season and only $25 million guaranteed, it's a heck of a job by Carolina and their front office. So they're clearly trying to revamp the defense. We had talked about it. Multiple reports had indicated that Carolina was going to be somebody that was looking to pursue Devin Lloyd. And lo and behold, at the end of day one of free agency, literally at 9 o'clock roughly Central Time here, Devin Lloyd gets signed to the Carolina Panthers. And now, the Jaguars, they're in a kind of interesting spot where, Foye Oluokun, they re-signed Dennis Gardeck earlier today, so that was good from the Jaguars' perspective. Do they believe in Jack Kaiser enough to step into that role? I'm not sure. Could they potentially look at the draft? There are some really talented day 2 prospects at the linebacker position. Anthony Hill, somebody we talked about here on the channel in terms of a linebacker potentially that the Jaguars could target during the 2026 NFL draft. So, I mean, they've got a lot of potential options. Josiah Trotter's another kid out of Missouri that I really like. Jake Golday, the linebacker out of Cincinnati. He's a long, rangy athlete, former defensive end from Central Arkansas, transferred to Cincinnati. He could be potentially in play for the Jacksonville Jaguars. they've got a lot of different options. And maybe in a future video, we'll talk about some potential options that the Jaguars could look at. I would be surprised, not surprised, but I wouldn't bet on the Jaguars potentially replacing Devin Lloyd in free agency at the linebacker spot. I think they have a decent amount of depth at that position, not clearly at the level of Devin Lloyd. No one's trying to say that, but to the point where, okay, Leo Chenal, if the price is right, maybe the Jaguars could look at, bringing him in. I know there's some other linebackers out there. To me, draft is the way to go, and it's the way that I think James Gladstone and Liam Coen are going to look to try to build this defense under now going into the second year under Anthony Campanelli's defense. And look, you're going to lose something with Devin Lloyd, obviously not having him in the lineup. He was a great athlete, true sideline-to-sideline linebacker, could play the run well, could play in coverage. There's a reason he was second-team All-Pro this year, guys. I mean, he was phenomenal as a Jacksonville Jaguar. And look, I mean, he wanted to get the bag. He talked about during the around the Pro Bowl that his heart's still in Jacksonville, that he's got a lot of personal people in his life that are in the Jacksonville area, but he's got to do ultimately what's best and what he thinks is best. And that ultimately decided for him to go to Carolina, which, shocker, I mean, the money was probably the best offer that he could get. So Devin Lloyd, it's kind of one of those things where I'm sad that he's obviously leaving Jacksonville. He got his money. It's kind of one of those things that unfortunately happens, and kind of similar to how I talked about it, where I didn't know if the Jaguars were going to re-sign, Lloyd, Etienne, or Monteric Brown. I thought Monteric Brown would be the most likely, just kind of given the scarcity of that position. They ultimately get his re-signing done right before free agency opens. Travis Etienne earlier today, he left for the New Orleans Saints for a 4-year, $52 million contract, $13 million per year. That's something that was always going to be out of the Jaguars' price range, and it was kind of sitting there. And I remember walking into the office thinking, okay, look, Devin Lloyd hasn't signed yet, but he could sign easily tonight or later, or going into the early morning here tomorrow. So he signs with Carolina. Again, if you're just re-highlighting it, 3 years, $45 million, $15 million per year with $25 million guaranteed. What's your one-word reaction? Let me know down in the comment section below to Devin Lloyd signing with the Carolina Panthers. My one-word reaction is unfortunate because, again, if the Jaguars had sat there and, again, maybe they were just kind of playing this out that they knew that they were going to have trouble fitting his fifth-year option underneath the cap, but it's one of those where, like, it would have really been nice to see Devin Lloyd have another year as a Jaguar in a Jacksonville uniform. So he's not going to. He's signed with Carolina, so it is unfortunate. Wish Devin Lloyd the best. He obviously, played really well for Jacksonville ever since he got drafted in the first round way back in 2022. So congrats to him. Hope the best for him in his career. And, now the Jaguars are going to have to replace him at linebacker. So we'll see ultimately kind of where the direction they go in. We'll probably look at some, replacement targets here on a future video, so make sure you guys subscribe and tune in for that. But now I wanted to get into the Brian Thomas Jr. portion of this video as my alarm goes off, so please ignore that, my text note. So here's what I'll say. I think Brian Thomas Jr. going into, literally, if you would have asked me this morning, was Brian Thomas Jr. going to get traded from the Jacksonville Jaguars? I would have told you no. Liam Coen and James Gladstone have given no public indication that they're looking to move on from Brian Thomas Jr. In fact, when they were asked at their end-of-season press conferences whether or not Brian Thomas Jr. would be, what's their plans for him, he said he's involved in their, 2026 plans, and that they truly felt like they have 3 number 1 receivers on the roster, Brian Thomas Jr., Parker Washington, and Jacoby Myers. So that was my opinion going in today. I've been tweeting about it constantly that I didn't think the Jaguars were going to trade Brian Thomas Jr., and I still feel mostly that way, but for the first time since these rumors have kind of started and speculated, we've got some real reporting per Connor Hughes, who does coverage for the Giants and I believe also the Jets for SNY there in New York. He put out this tweet during free agency at about 3:06 Central, and I'm just going to read it for you guys. Quote, Jaguars are entertaining offers for wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr., SNY TV has learned. Both the Jets and Giants explored Thomas at the trade deadline last year, but Jacksonville wasn't willing to do any deal. That stance has changed. And then he notes that Thomas Jr. had a down year this year compared to his rookie year back in 2024. So, look, I'm going to just kind of, highlight this point before I kind of dive in to Brian Thomas Jr. and the possibility of whether or not he could get traded. I don't think he will. Still, I think that it is still going to take an offer that the Jaguars simply cannot refuse for them to move off of Brian Thomas Jr. I think that whether or not, he is ideal in Liam Coen's scheme, whether or not, Liam Coen and him get along, or any of the other rumors that have been kind of circulating throughout Twitter and whatnot, I think it's irrelevant. I'm looking at this strictly from a team management perspective, okay? Did Brian Thomas Jr. have the best year last year? No. In fact, comparatively, I'll just kind of read off the quick stats. His rookie year had 87 catches for over 1,200 yards, 10 touchdowns. Set in the league on fire as a rookie. This past year, 48 catches, 707 yards, 2 touchdowns. Significant downgrades across the board. And, excuse me, I don't believe that Brian Thomas Jr., even if you want to say he is the third wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and there's a real possibility that could be the case. I mean, Jacoby Myers and Parker Washington are two talented individuals. I just think that if you're the Jaguars and you've got Liam Coen in this offense kind of humming, obviously you let Travis Etienne go because you're not able to fit him in under the cap. But for the most part, they're bringing everybody back. We'll talk about Johnny Munn, who was cut earlier today, but you cut him as a blocking tight end, $2.7 million against the cap. And I think the Jaguars are going to revamp the tight end room. I would still expect them to keep Britton Strange, who had a really nice season for them last season. I just think that Brian Thomas Jr. is a third wide receiver that Trevor Lawrence can use at times and did have moments last year where, again, he looked like his 2024 self. The Jaguars also still have 2 years of control, barring even if they don't want to pick up his fifth-year option on his contract. I just don't see any reason why they would force a trade. Now, in terms of them just listening for offers, sure. I don't necessarily, put that as a shock or a surprise that, Gladstone and Coen are sitting there openly listening to trade offers for Brian Thomas Jr. because, again, there's reasons that, he did struggle last year. Was it potentially attitude-related problems? Was it the fact that he was having trouble going over the middle? Was it the fact that, contested catches and all this, that, and the other? Again, I'm not going to dive into what happened last season in terms of, the little nuanced stuff. But, look, he had a down year, and the Jaguars are sitting there, and James Gladstone's looking at this roster saying, okay, we're not in the best cap situation right now. If we could potentially look to offload Brian Thomas Jr., if some team's willing to offer us an insane package, which, again, Brian Thomas Jr. on the open market, what is he worth? Probably a day 2 pick, probably a third-round pick, because he's still young. He's had 1,000 yards in his career, but again, coming off a down year where his stock's not the greatest. So you're not going to get, in terms of normal circumstances, you wouldn't get a first-round pick for Brian Thomas Jr., at least not in my opinion. However, if a team is desperate enough and sitting there saying, hey, we really want Brian Thomas Jr., what is it going to take? And Jacksonville's saying, hey, listen, a day 2 pick's not going to be good enough, or at least maybe not a round 3 pick. Could the Jaguars potentially listen for, an early second if something, comes on the table? Or dare I say, how about a late first-round pick? That would be something where James Gladstone and Liam Coen, no matter what their feelings are on Brian Thomas Jr., they'd have to listen and consider it. I don't know what the potential Giants or Jets are offering at this current moment. I have no sourcing on that. This is just pure speculation from my end. But I am kind of sitting here wondering, Brian Thomas Jr., at least now that we have legitimate reporting, because, again, Jonathan Jones just recently reported, we talked about on the show, that the Jaguars were not listening to any offers for BTJ. So at least you have Connor Hughes, who, again, is a respected reporter. He does really good work for SNY. It's conflicting, but at least you now have to hear that side of the argument instead of just random kind of accounts that are floating this possibility for Jacksonville. And again, Diana Rossini reported that the Jaguars were interested on Max Crosby. There have been kind of random, kind of sliver reports, kind of throughout Twitter and whatnot that the Jaguars could be interested in Jalen Carter from the Philadelphia Eagles. Was Brian Thomas Jr.'s name brought up in any of those conversations? Possibly. I don't know if they would be or not, but, he's a young trade piece that, if James Gladstone's sitting there trying to make moves for these, big names, they don't have a first-round pick this year. Could Brian Thomas Jr. be a name that, James Gladstone's throwing out there, not again to replace a first-round pick value, but just to kind of sit there and say, hey, listen, Brian Thomas Jr., what's his value? Maybe try to gauge his worth. So, and maybe now they're kind of listening to offers from, say, the Jets, the Giants, or whomever the case may be, in terms of how other teams view Brian Thomas Jr. and kind of taking everything into evaluation. So, long story short, and kind of a long-winded answer to say, I still, if I had to bet money on it, I would bet that Brian Thomas Jr. is a Jaguar for 2026. However, my confidence level in that has taken a little bit of a hit just in terms of the fact that they are listening, and they have, again, this is, I believe, a legitimate report from Connor Hughes that they are listening to offers for Brian Thomas Jr. It's something that we're going to discuss here on the channel going forward until either James Gladstone or Liam Coen shut it down or whatever the case may be. But this is a story that's not going to go away, especially during free agency where you're seeing teams, try to bid for wide receivers. We saw Mike Evans get, a big contract from the San Francisco 49ers today. Rashid Shaheed got a decent contract from the Seattle Seahawks to return to Seattle. Receivers are getting paid nowadays, so, and, their value for teams that don't get those wide receivers that need them. I mean, for example, the New England Patriots, again, I'm not saying they are looking to trade for Brian Thomas Jr., they could potentially look at, if they don't get A.J. Brown, could BTJ be an option to maybe try to swing big on a trade? Would the Cleveland Browns, right, trying to build around Shedeur Sanders, Todd Monken as the head coach, could they potentially look to trade for Brian Thomas Jr.? All that will remain to be seen, but I think at the moment right now, Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be a Jacksonville Jaguar until further notice, but I still think there is a possibility that he could end up elsewhere, and we have to acknowledge it and at least discuss the possibility here on the channel. All right, I know it's been a longer video, so I'm just going to wrap it up with this. Again, to kind of briefly mention it, but Johnny Munt was cut today. Jaguars tight end, really good blocking tight end, but the cut did save Jacksonville $2.7 million against the cap. And look, I think, again, this comes back to Over the Cap and Spotrac. So I don't think Over the Cap's updated their number because this was similar to the number that we had going into free agency. Over the Cap lists the Jaguars cap space at around $110,000. Spotrac, at the time I'm filming this, lists the Jaguars cap space at $6.7 million. I'm willing to bet it's closer to the Spotrac number. Now, again, I want to give Over the Cap the credit because they do a really great job. Either way, the Jaguars cleared some space by cutting Johnny Munt. I still think that they're going to have an overall in that tight end room behind Britton Strange. We talked about potential prospects that they've interviewed at the NFL Combine. Wouldn't be shocked to me if they draft one during the 2026 NFL Draft. Pretty big moves for James Gladstone and the crew on day one. Again, just highlighting some of them. They re-signed Monterey Brown. I thought that was a really good decision. Even though it's at $11 million per year, which is on the high end of what I would re-sign him, I think you have to keep that core four at the cornerback position intact, which they did. Travis Etienne walks to New Orleans. And now, just to re-highlight that Devin Lloyd is a Carolina Panther going for 2026. We'll see how James Gladstone and the crew respond because this division, the AFC South, is very winnable for the Jaguars going into next season. So thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Jags Now, presented by Chat Sports. Like I said, we're going to give you cover whenever Jags news or rumors kind of hits the airwaves. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you made it to the end of the video, you know what time it is. It's time for a little Duval roll call. If you made it this far, I need you guys to spam Duval down below in the comment section. Until next time, we'll see you on the next one.